All right, so today we have the Apostate joining us. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself, or at least your internet persona?
Okay. Well, my internet persona is kind of limited to Twitter right now. But for a while, I had a blog that I started, I guess, back in 2013, and was pretty prolific on there. And I don't know about prolific, but I wrote a while, a couple years, and then it kind of ran its course, and I got busy. Life kind of got in the way, and I haven't really committed much to it since. I have a bunch of ideas that I've kind of jotted down, but just haven't really found the time to put forth the effort to get any more out there.
Okay. So what was your religious background and upbringing like?
So, I didn't remember a time when I didn't believe in God and Jesus Christ, his son, and the resurrection and all of the basic sort of tenets of Christianity. But it was an evangelical background. My mom, who was mainly the one who was carrying me to church, she came out of Southern Baptist churches, and so that's primarily where we would go. We visited like a evangelical free church a couple times, and some independent Baptist churches, but for the most part, it was a Southern Baptist evangelical upbringing. And then my wife and I moved out of that to eventually a Presbyterian PCA denomination through some, I guess my theological journey led me there as an adult. But
Right.
For most of my Christianity, I was a Southern Baptist.
Okay. Just a side note, I probably should have said this before we started, but for some reason my internet has been weird. So if I drop out, I'll refresh and I should be back in the stream.
Okay, yeah, I'll just carry on with the audience, waiting for you to return.
Yeah, say some smack talk or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, you had blogged a little bit about so evangelical Baptist. Some of your blog makes it seem like, I forget, there's a post called like the Christianity's culture of pious fraud, where you go through like all these like lies, like, so it seems like I would say that I was kind of raised with evangelical subculture, but it seems like your experience was still very different from mine. If you want to elaborate on some of that.
Yeah, so you're a little bit behind me on some decades there, probably, or at least over a decade. So I came up in that culture pre-internet, when pastors, evangelists could pretty much just say whatever they wanted, and no one was really going to be there to, look it up. Like it wasn't like you couldn't go home and get on the internet and like be like, the evangelist said this, and I don't believe that, and I'm going to look it up, and now you can pull it out of your pocket and be sitting in the sermon listening to well, the Greek says this, and you can just kind of like Google it and be like, no, it doesn't. So there were a lot of these just for lack of a better word, bullshit that came out of the pulpit in my experience. And then I think as the popularity of the internet kind of grew, that some of that had to be capped a little bit. I mean, it still goes on. Even I left my last church in 2012, and I remember sitting in Sunday school classes listening to people talk about certain things, and I would be like, yeah, that's an urban legend. Like, I don't even have to like Google it. I just know. And then I would go home, and sure enough, there'd be like a Snopes article like, yeah, that didn't happen. But there was no Snopes in the 80s, so we just kind of like, if your local public library couldn't refute it, you were just left to the whims of whatever they were saying.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Like you said, there's still some of that on the internet. It just seems like the internet has helped tone it down in general. But every now and then you'll see like scientists, this giant skull, like the Neanderthal, like this big giant skull. You know what I'm saying? Stupid shit like that.
Yeah, it's I mean, a family member of mine a couple of years ago shared an article that had like, chariots underwater under the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army found or whatever, and it was just like, no. And I think the internet has been kind of a double-edged sword in that it has allowed for just the drastic proliferation and all of the sort of people that had crazy ideas to kind of collectively get together and find community in that abnormality and craziness in a way that they couldn't before, and that has allowed a proliferation of this. There's some other things I think I would attribute it to, like the fairness doctrine and stuff like that, where people can pretty much just say anything they want, and if it confirms my priors, then that's what I want to hear, and if it doesn't, then I reject it. And that's what the internet has kind of allowed. And before, when you had 3 TV networks that were all pretty much doing whatever the New York Times and Washington Post were doing for the lead that day, and they all kind of had to have on both sides, you didn't have the kind of insanity that you have now. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. You can if you think critically and you kind of know how to evaluate sources, then the internet is just like going to crush a lot of the just utter bullshit. But if you don't know how to do that, if you don't have those tools, then it can also just completely like blow up your thinking, as we've seen with like all of the QAnon and all that stuff going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't necessarily want to go down that road, but yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, well, I was going to ask you this later in the stream, but since we're talking about the internet now, how do you see, like you said, there's this, on the one hand, it cuts through a lot of bullshit, but on the other, you can find pockets of it. How do you think it's going to affect the religion long term? Like, I'm curious to see.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like the jury's still out, and we're in an environment now where you can kind of choose your news and whatever you want. It's like you can create your own echo chamber, whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media, and then you can pick your own news network that tells you what you want to hear, and so you can kind of create your own confirmation bias echo chamber. And so I don't know if that is gonna, I think in some places that's gonna hurt particularly fundamentalist religion, but in other places it's just gonna make it even more extreme, I think.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I was just wondering about, like, because I don't know if this is probably not a perfect analogy, but I've heard it compared to, like, the printing press kind of exploded Catholicism's dominance, at a certain period in history. So I was just, it's not a perfect analogy, but I was just curious as to see maybe what will happen with the internet, at least in our lifetime. I don't know. Time will tell.
Yeah.
So you were basically, like, I guess, evangelical Baptist, and you had said that you moved to a Presbyterian church. What was fill that in a little bit. Like, what caused that move for you?
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of the moves that I've made theologically have been motivated by my children. And that's kind of what moved us out of the theology of Southern Baptists. I mean, when I say I was like a Southern Baptist, I mean, like, I was about as Southern Baptist as you could be. I went to, I was a messenger to the Southern Baptist Convention a few times. I was a youth pastor. I was an education minister. I was considering, possibly even going to like one of the major seminaries, either SBTS or one of the satellite campuses. So, yeah, I mean, I was, I was probably one of the few Baptists who'd actually read the Baptist Faith and Message. So, so I was very familiar with it. And I had I have a relative who was a Southern Baptist missionary, so big ties. And but what happened when kind of kids came along was I started, revisiting some of my theology with respect to how I was going to raise my kids. And I think what brought me out of that brought me to Presbyterianism was ultimately their view of how to recognize members of the covenant community or members of the church. And as a Baptist, we had dedication ceremonies which aren't anywhere in the Bible. We had you would indoctrinate kids from the time they could speak, and you were treating them like visible members of the church. But you were just like sitting there, like waiting for them to have this sort of like crisis moment where they, had to go through the motions of, repenting of their sins and confessing and believing and being baptized. And that all kind of seemed, it just didn't logically cohere. And I was like, I'm going to raise my kids in the nurture and admonition of Christ from the time that they can walk. So I'm going to treat them like Christians. They're going to be recognized as members of the church. And so what is the initiatory rite into the church? Well, it's baptism. And so it makes sense to baptize, babies into the church. And it wasn't so much a scriptural argument. I mean, it was, you can make one, but it was more just the, sort of necessary consequence of the theology that I had developed at that time. And, I had read a few things. I think B.B. Warfield probably has one of the best, advocacies for infant baptism, and I read that and I was like, this is it. This makes sense. So obviously, at that point, I got to find a place I can get my kid splashed, and the Baptist church wasn't going to do it.
Yeah. See, so for me, I mean, it wasn't the whole thing, but I was, I don't have kids, at least not right now. But it was, my evangelical upbringing was kind of like this getting saved multiple times, like did you really ask Jesus into your heart? And so the appeal of like the Presbyterian system is like, they don't make as big of a deal as like this conversion moment, that you have this, that you're saved. It's more like, are you right now trusting in Christ for your salvation? Okay. That's good.
Yeah, like, that totally made sense to me. It totally made sense to my wife. I coming up in a Baptist church, with all of the sort of Finneyism that had been inherited in that tradition, where you had to have an altar call at the end of every service, and I know there's a lot of Baptists now that resist that. But yeah, I mean, I guess I got saved by sort of evangelical standards when I was 6. But yeah, I mean, who knows if it takes, Yeah. I mean, I can remember sitting, in church it wasn't a Southern Baptist church. It was an independent Baptist church, but not like an independent fundamentalist Baptist church. They had close enough ties with like the local Southern Baptist churches that I actually did pulpit supply for them years later. But I remember sitting in church as a kid. I was probably like 10 or 11. So it's been 4 years after my first sort of profession of faith. And he actually ripped off an A.W. Criswell sermon on the wheat and the tares. I don't know if you're familiar with the sermon, but it's from like the 1960s or 70s or whatever. But he just I didn't realize that pastors do that until like years later, but he pretty much just verbatim ripped off the sermon. And the whole thing was, it's based on the parable of Jesus. Are you a wheat or are you a tare? Were you a tare sown among the wheats? And right. Is it all just appearances? And are you just really good at that? And do you know? And are you sure that you know? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. and then so you're like, pray this prayer after me, and you do it, and I don't know how many times I did that in church. Just like, you know what? just to be sure, let's just give it one more round.
Yeah.
And so when I came across, the Reformed doctrines and confessional Reformed theology, I was like, yeah, this totally makes sense. Like it's whether or not you believe now. Do you trust Christ now? Are you looking to like his atoning work now? Not whether or not you can remember a time when you like repented of your sins and gave your heart to Jesus, whatever that means. And so it really like made sense with me. And my wife was the same way. Like she had always had this kind of like, she always felt like she was like, it was like coattails Christianity for her, because she didn't have the kind of, emotional experience of God and like God's presence. And honestly, I think she just doesn't have as good of imagination as some folks. And I think for people that really don't have a very active imagination, it's difficult for them to kind of conjure that experience up. And for her, it was like, it just really clicked that, yeah, it's whether or not I believe now, whether or not I trust Christ now, and am I actively exercising my faith and all of those things. And it wasn't so much about, this burning in your heart or whatever, or feeling like somebody was speaking to you. That was the other thing too, was the whole evangelicalism, they throw around things like, God has a plan for you and you have to find your plan and purpose in life. And, Reformed theology kind of offered, you just obey the Bible and, and then God gives you like the pleasures of your heart. And you're like, okay, there wasn't that same, there's this special plan and purpose that you have to find. And so that was really appealing to me. I'm really playing up the theology, but there's a dark side to it too.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure we'll get to that. Were you a Calvinist when you were a Southern Baptist as well?
So
at least with the doctrines of grace.
No, in fact, we had a music minister that who was my first real experience with Calvinism. And prior to that, Calvinism, this was about the time that Calvinism started to kind of like pick up steam in the Southern Baptist Convention. I mean, now it's like pretty much standard at SBTS, thanks to the leadership there. I mean, that's kind of like, you can be there, you can go there and not, hold to however many points you want, but yeah, it's kind of like the thing. And at the time, no, that was not the case. And Calvinists, I had seen like tracts and stuff that like were like, Calvinism is heresy and it's sending people to hell and stuff, because they won't go soul winning because they think everybody's just like the frozen chosen or whatever. And my first encounter with that was somebody who was a music minister in a Baptist church, and he kind of taught a little bit about it and went through the sort of major passages and stuff in the Bible. And I found it really convincing on an intellectual level, but sort of emotionally, I was like, this doesn't seem right, but there it is in black and white in my Bible, and Jacob I loved and Esau I hated, and I hardened Pharaoh's heart so that I could destroy him, and I mean all of the things that sort of go along with that, and then just sort of the logical progression of it, and honestly I think I found Calvinism's theodicy logically consistent. I mean, God is just evil. They don't say that. But that's kind of like, he has to bring like these terrible things as an expression of his wrath. Otherwise he couldn't show it. So he just had to do it. And it's like, okay, I guess that's consistent. Like that explains evil and suffering and hell. So I'm good with that. And you don't realize that they've kind of snuck in like Malthyism right there. Right. So yeah, and it does all kinds of things to the way that you view your fellow human beings, the way you view God, and the way you think God expresses himself, and all of those things have some pretty heavy baggage that maybe the other stuff doesn't really make up for.
Yeah. Well, you were just based on our conversations, it seems like you were a little bit of a bigwig. Like you met Horton and Truman and all these people.
Yeah, I wasn't a big wig. I was more like a, I don't know what you would like, kind of a roadie, I guess, or what do you call the people that just hang around the band but don't actually, do anything?
Groupie?
Yeah, groupie. Yeah, groupie.
Yeah.
Not roadie. Roadies actually do stuff. I was more of a groupie. But yeah, no, I just happened to be in proximity to some of those people. I doubt they would even remember me or know me from anything. I mean, I kind of just sat there, and like, whoa, that's Michael Horton,
Yeah.
and he's smoking a cigar right in front of me, talking about framework theology. This is awesome.
Yeah. Oh man. So all right, so you move from Baptist background to Presbyterianism. Oh, the other thing I was going to say about that too before I move on from that is so the other reason I found it convincing, other than just it seemed more logically consistent and it made more sense of the Christian life, which is what you were just saying, is that there was also a lot of passages about like falling away, like in Hebrews and in Romans 11, that it made sense to have like this group of people that was part of the church that could be really truly spoken of as having fallen away, so that you don't actually, because I felt like a Reformed Baptist would have to play those passages down, whereas a Presbyterian could be like, no, they really fell away. Like they were really part of the covenant community and fell away.
Yeah. And there's, I don't know how, it may have been a little before you, but there's always theological wars going on within, Reformed traditions. The Machen's warrior children and all that. But there was a big sort of brouhaha that blew up over kind of how that works. How are we supposed to think of the sort of visible members of the church and apostasy, and what is salvific and what isn't, and a lot of, and you know enough about that tradition to know that anytime somebody stepped outside of whatever someone's interpretation of confessional standards was, it was like, oh, he's a heretic, Get him out of here. But you're right. It was more consistent. You can find a lot of what I would consider logical consistency, a lot more logical consistency in the Reformed traditions than you can in sort of fluffy, evangelical Baptist type stuff. And that was the appeal to me. Definitely the intellectual side and the ability to kind of engage with Scripture. I mean, there just seemed like a greater commitment to that, whether it was through biblical theology or whatever. Now that was, of course, through a specific lens,
right?
And a lot of it basically just boiled down to like gentrified religious extremism. But it was appealing to on the intellectual side. Yeah.
So you're a Presbyterian. What exactly led to the deconversion? Like, what was the process like? As far.
Okay, this is, I guess, the part where he's lost. Oh, wait, he's back. Okay.
Well, that was weird.
Sorry, you glitched a little bit there.
Okay.
On my end, anyway.
What was I don't know what you heard, so I'll just repeat my question. What led to your deconversion, so far as you could summarize that?
Yeah, summarize. That's a good. So I guess it's funny because my last pastor used to give the illustration. He was, I think, raised Lutheran, but didn't Missouri Synod Lutheran, I should clarify. So like conservative Lutherans, but didn't make a profession of faith until he was, in college, and claims that was the point of his conversion, that he was basically just a baptized heathen until that point. But he talks about how because his parents like catechized him and he was raised in the church in Missouri Synod, and so he said, all of the furniture was in the room. Someone just needed to turn the light on, is how he would express that. And I would express my deconversion the same way. That all the furniture was in the room. Someone just needed to turn the light on. And I don't know. I mean, we can't attribute that to the Holy Spirit, obviously, the way he would. But yeah, I mean, as I went through, I went to a fundamentalist Baptist Christian school all through high school, actually from 7th grade on. And so I was just constantly swimming in my own, Christian bubble, between going to school Monday through Friday, going to church Wednesday night, Sunday, morning, 2 services plus, youth group and youth choir and all that other stuff. I mean, I was spending a ton of time just immersed in the culture and really with no voices whatsoever that would speak against that would confront that in any way meaningfully. Everything was a straw man. Whether I was taking 10th grade biology with my, Bob Jones University biology book, and evolution's silly and here's why, that kind of stuff. And so, that was the world that I came out of. And then I ended up going to a public university out of a private Christian school. And I ended up, taking courses. I majored in history and minored in philosophy. And that was a bit of a shock to go from sort of just swimming in that evangelical Christianity for, all of my life, and then never having really confronted anything like that before. And so, what I found out really quick was that people like Josh McDowell just weren't going to cut it. And I kind of had to really, dig for stuff. I mean, that was the first time I had confronted, Mackey and Hume and, when I took philosophy of religion. I mean, that was really the first instance of confronting that. And of course, it was presented in a balanced manner. So, I mean, I got to see, Anselm and Aquinas and, Pascal and all of those people and what they had to say also. But what I kind of took away from that was, okay, there's some really good arguments here for Christianity that I kind of already knew a little bit about. And then there's also this stuff arguing against it that I hadn't really heard before and seems a lot stronger than I thought it was. And so, this isn't as airtight and concrete as I thought it was kind of what I took away from that. And I had a couple of periods of like really deep doubt. I mean, I took historical geology, which just kind of like blew up the whole like evolution isn't true thing. I mean, we went on a field trip and like I saw the rocks, man. Like the earth is old and like stuff evolved. Like you kind of like you can't once you're sitting there looking at like an Archaeopteryx replica and you're seeing like the sort of progression and you're seeing, the similarities and, all of this stuff. It was just like, yeah, this happened. And so I had to find a way to fit that in my theology, which I did. I mean, there's plenty of room, even in, some of the more evangelical circles for that. And then, but there was a few times that I had periods of doubt. But ultimately I think I ended up like I hung on kind of some of the stuff that like Kierkegaard had written. I mean, he was like, he was kind of like, at least what I understood him to be saying was like, yeah, apologetics is stupid. We're not going to come up with like a rational explanation for like, the hypostatic union and stuff. You just got to believe. Like you just got to believe. It just doesn't make sense. Like look at Abraham and Isaac. Like he was told to sacrifice Isaac, and he believed that contradictory things at the same time. Like God had promised him that he was going to, bless him through Isaac. And at the same time, he was telling him to kill Isaac. And, he believed contradictory things at the same time. And that's kind of what you have to do. Like, just expect that you're going to have to do that. There's paradoxes and, you're just not going to be able to explain them. And this is the way it is. And that was okay to me, so I was like, okay, yeah, we'll go with Kierkegaard. And there was always, it seemed like there was always somebody that I could kind of like fall back on. There was always a backstop, and it never really pushed me over the edge to where I was like, yeah, maybe God's not real. I mean, I always found some way to stay in that headspace and keep believing.
Well, that's interesting that you say. So, go ahead. Keep going.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say.
I need to regain my train of thought anyway.
Okay. I was going to say. So for me, and I've shared this elsewhere as well, but my furniture in the room kind of experience was because of I grew up with the internet, like when I'm very young. So I was like, when I was 14, I was like arguing on message boards with atheists, like about whether Christianity was true. And like, so I had those confrontations very early. But at the time it didn't really do anything. But then, as I've said before, like I've done extended evangelism where I've taken people through apologetics books, but through that interaction, that's what hit me hard, is that the arguments aren't as strong as I thought they were. So it was a combination of a lot of things, but there was just over time, it just kind of wore on me that like what I'm trying to argue people into, I slowly lost confidence, like in the arguments themselves. So
yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what my takeaway was. After studying philosophy at a public university, was that this isn't as it's not going to be as easy to convince people of these things that have sort of studied views on it. I mean, it just wasn't going to be as easy, and I was okay with that because you still have like the Holy Spirit, like it's God's work, and so that probably all of that, my sort of disillusionment with I guess classical apologetics and natural theology, I felt like it could hold up, but it wasn't gonna tip the balance for a non-believer. Like that wasn't gonna be it. And so that was kind of what I took away from that. And like I said, I was okay with it. I continued to try to evangelize to people because frankly, I knew that, most people weren't going to be familiar with these arguments anyway. And so you could get away with, I mean, I even still used more than a carpenter to witness to, one of my coworkers one time who was a self-described agnostic. I think he just was a apatheist. Mm-hmm. And he was just kind of like looking for an excuse to get involved with a group of Christians who he liked and didn't share, theological views with, but really wanted to like them and be in their sort of group. And I kind of gave him enough of an excuse to get over the intellectual hurdles to get him to commit to Christ. And then he was able to do what he wanted to do, which was go to church and hang out with these people that he liked. So it was enough to kind of, just use classical arguments for theism, and then hit him with the resurrection evidence, and that was all he needed. But yeah, so I still did that, and it wasn't until I started after sort of giving my heart to John Calvin, was when I started looking more into Reformed theology, and lo and behold, happened on presuppositionalism, and I hadn't encountered that in philosophy, religion. They just didn't really discuss it, and now I kind of know why. But but I was like, they basically just admitted what I kind of already suspected, which is like natural theology, evidentialism, it just doesn't get you there, and it's never going to get you there because these people are unregenerate. Like they're corrupted by their sin, and if they were regenerate, these arguments would work. Like it would totally work because they would see that the truth there, but they're never going to work on an unregenerate person. So you can use them, but unless the Holy Spirit has transformed their heart, it's just not going to work. And and that was kind of like, oh, okay, they're just basically like admitting like this doesn't work. And so they're like, what does work? And then you just basically had to like show that you had to demonstrate that, well, their worldview just completely won't hold up. It's, it won't withstand, internal critique. You can use a reductio ad absurdum on them, and it'll collapse the atheist worldview because they'll have to rely on logic and induction and things like that, and they'll have no foundation for it like we will. So it's like, okay, yeah, this is really impressive. Okay, yeah, not real. The irony, of course, being that that's also completely circular. And but they were upfront with that. Yeah, it is. But it boiled down to like God told me and he didn't tell them, and
yep.
That's just the way it is. So that I kind of embraced presuppositionalism as a result of kind of being disillusioned with the other forms of apologetics, and that was my go-to. And it was nice because before I had the view that I had to work really hard to like get people saved. The school that I went to had visitation every Thursday night, and they would load up on buses and go like door to door and stuff, and go soul winning was what they would call it. And I thought we really had to do that. And then through sort of Reformed theology and all of the baggage that came along with it, I was like, we just gotta like preach the word, and if God changes their heart, that's on him. And that was very freeing to me. But at the same time, it also it changes the way you view your fellow human beings, because you're constantly like evaluating them as like unregenerate. They're hopeless. Like we're never going to get through to you because of your foolish heart that's darkened by your sin.
Yeah. So
I still haven't got to my deconversion.
Yeah, I was about to follow. No, you're fine. Take as much time. Well, I will say one more thing though before you leave. So I was just thinking too. I have a theory, and maybe it's true, but it seems like maybe like the earlier in life someone gets into presup, the more likely they'll deconvert later. That's my theory, because I feel like for me it was kind of I wouldn't say like a last ditch thing, but I'm kind of when I was in Reformed theology and I started embracing it in the same way, it was comforting in the same way that you just described, because it's like, well, this other stuff doesn't work, but this is kind of like a last bastion of like, me between the unbelieving world. And in some ways, it seems like the ultimate defense mechanism, so I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it really is a way to kind of like close off a lot of objections that you might internally have because of the way you view the people around you. And I mean, it's an intellectually satisfying way to go about doing that, to kind of putting those things off. And that kind of, I guess, is a good segue into what led to my deconversion. So after being involved in the PCA church for a while, I was evaluated to be a member of the session. I even like passed their theology test. Which was, is like people that come out of like Baptist churches and evangelicalism are like, what? You had to take a theology test? And what is a session? So I was kind of being evaluated for that. I'm just not very good with the sort of glad handing side of, being an elder, particularly ruling elder who was like shepherding over their own little group, and you had to be able to do that. And I'm not extroverted. I don't have the social skills as much. So I could get up in front of people and teach like Sunday school classes, and I wasn't allowed to preach, obviously, because you had to be a teaching elder to do that. But I would teach Sunday school classes. I led youth Bible study. Went on mission trips, stuff like that. And I just didn't have the stuff that you needed to kind of like glad hand and console people, and those things. And I probably wouldn't have been very successful as a Baptist preacher either if I'd have gone that route because of those things. I mean, I'd have been fine in the pulpit, but when it came time to like shake hands and visit in people's living rooms, I'd have been terrible. I just wasn't good at it. So while I was there, very involved in that church, about as involved as anybody could be. And again, my kids were sort of what pushed me out into the next sort of phase of my theological understanding, because my daughter was getting to the age where she was going to start asking questions beyond, what she was being catechized in. I mean, we were hardcore Reformed Presbyterians in that we did family worship like every day. Are you familiar? Your audience might not be familiar with what that is, but it's what it sounds like. Yeah. Like we would basically sit down together as a family and have a Bible study every day. We read through the Bible in over like 3 years. We just would read like a chapter a night. And as a family, we read through the entire Bible. I mean, I was reading, and then, I would lead prayer, and we would go through catechism questions, and, when they got a little more understanding, we would read stories from like a children's Bible, a Reformed approved children's Bible, not like the Precious Moments one or whatever. So we would, and like in the car, we would listen to like a catechism CD that was set to music. I mean, we were just heavily indoctrinating our kids. And because, as a parent, like you want to protect your kids. And what's your biggest fear as a parent who believes in eternal conscious torment in the wrath and curse of God forever? Well, that's your biggest fear, is that your kid's going to go to hell. And even though Reformed theology gives you an out and says, like, if people are chosen, like you don't have any control over that. It's sort of it's almost a double bind, in that they tell you, okay, yes, you have no control over that, but like God uses means, and he makes promises to his covenant community. And so if you do what you're supposed to do, if you raise your children in the nurture and admonition of Christ, if you talk to them, along the way, and, in the home and everything, then chances are they're going to make a profession, and they're going to believe, and, they're going to go to heaven. So you got to do your thing, but ultimately it's up to like the Holy Spirit, whether or not, God changes their hearts. So we were like big into doing that. And, I knew from going to school and from, seeing the proliferation of the internet that they were going to be faced with challenges to their faith. They were going to be faced with arguments that I hadn't had to be faced with when I was a teenager, because I was able to kind of live in a bubble. And I knew that the minute that they opened a computer, they were going to be faced with that, or the minute they encountered, they went off to college or whatever, they were going to encounter that. And I wanted to prepare them as best I could for that onslaught. And so I started really looking at the claims of Christianity and apologetics methods from the standpoint of like, okay, what if somebody's trying to like talk my kid out of Christianity? Like, how would I get them to have a bulwark against that? And also, like, how can I like start raising little, Christian warriors who are going to go off and spread the gospel too, and be successful in this environment, doing that. And so I started kind of really studying things from almost an outside perspective, like really trying to put my head into, a non-believer's headspace and think of like, okay, what are the objections here? And, I started like looking for objections instead of just accepting stuff. And, I can remember one of the first sort of cracks came when I was looking at the doctrine of sola scriptura, basic Protestant doctrine, and kind of seeing what it hinged on, how it, kind of tied together with the canon formation. And it was a really messy process. I mean, canon formation was a really messy process. I had argued theology with, Catholics before over that issue, and, arguing sola ecclesia versus sola scriptura, whether or not all of those things were based on the church or the Bible. And so I'd argued that position before, and I thought, they kind of made some good points. But I also see like how their position has some real problems too. And then and then it becomes like, well, maybe they're both wrong, which is a possibility. They could maybe they're both wrong. Maybe this one's not right and this one's not right, and they're both wrong. And then, I just kind of started down that path. And, in Bible reading, I would come across passages. When you're reading the Bible straight through, you're going to come across passages like in Deuteronomy where, if a woman, grabs a guy by the cojones while two men are fighting, you got to cut off her hand. And it says like, show her no mercy. And you're just like, wow, that's a little excessive, And of course you can come up with like theological reasons for that. Like, oh, well, she was threatening the promised seed potentially by doing that. And you could come up with all kinds of like reasons for like, through that sort of prism. But at the end of the day, it was just like, wow, that's harsh, man. I mean, that's just one of those weird things. Like, it didn't like Canaanite genocide didn't bother me, but cut her hand off and show her no mercy did for whatever reason. So, things like that started jumping out, and just other passages in the Old Testament that are problematic. And you can't really, you can't really reconcile those in a good way and still maintain that kind of confessional, Reformed Presbyterian position, as I guess like somebody like Pete Enns could tell you, because he got run out of Westminster on a rail. And somebody, I remember one of the elders remarking, one of the ruling elders remarking that like, heresy always starts in the Old Testament.
One of my when I was deconverting, my process, I was a little bit earlier than my wife's. And so there was a period, like I went through a short period of anger where I just wasn't going to church as I was kind of processing all of it. And my wife was still going. And one of our pastors said that Peter Enns is going to have a special place in hell. one of our PCA pastors.
Wow. So
I couldn't believe he said that to my wife.
I actually was on this. I mean, when all that was going on, I was hearing sort of the other side of that conversation in like Carl Trueman's circle, and I mean, him and Pete Enns were friends, and I mean that was hard for them. I mean, it wasn't. I mean, these are your kids played together presumably, so it's easy for the people that are outside of that to just kind of like tear those folks down. But for the people that are involved in it, it's a really, when you're going to outgroup someone, it's not easy. And, I have appreciation for that now. At the time I was really angry after deconverting, which I guess I got a little bit of time to go into that, but yeah, so getting back to like what led to it, I guess it was kind of all of those things started to pile up. And then, one day I was watching a YouTube video or somebody talking about their deconversion, and they weren't from the Reformed faith. They were from another evangelical wing of evangelicalism. and I don't even remember who it was, but they described the process of deconversion and what led to it as kind of like different parts of a network starting to collapse. So, one part collapses and you can still maintain the network with the other parts. But if enough of the components start to, collapse, then the whole thing just caves in, and you kind of like realize that, like, I don't need this hypothesis anymore. Right. It's just not necessary. And I was laying in bed one night just thinking about stuff, and it occurred to me, like, I don't need that hypothesis anymore. Like, God maybe doesn't exist. And once I sort of like made that kind of acknowledgement to myself on an intellectual level, it was like the light came on, and there was all this furniture there, all of the stuff from years before, when I had taken philosophy of religion in college, and all of the different objections that I had studied, and all of it was kind of there, and then it was just like a process of like, well, what have I missed? And then I start reading, critical biblical scholars that, I had previously just never even, bothered to pick up, whether it was Ehrman or, any of the other sort of critical biblical scholars, whether they were, believers or not, and just in the, whether they were mainline Protestants or even, a few Catholics or whatever, and then it's everything that I was reading like started to make sense. Like, oh, these really are contradictions. Oh, like the human beings really did put this together. Like the reason why this looks so messy is because there was no like divine, presence sort of guiding the process. Everything just like is the way you would expect it to be if it was completely natural processes. Right. And it just, everything just clicked from that point. I mean, now that's on an intellectual level. On an emotional level, it was gut wrenching. It was jarring. Because I realized very early on that, this is going to bring my world down. All of my friends, everybody I knew, my wife, my kids, everybody that I, in my sort of social circle, was a believer, with the exception of like my work colleagues. And, many of them obviously were too, but just a sort of, a lot of them may not care, but because they don't sort of know you in that context. But yeah, that was really tough. Fortunately, I got to a point where I kind of started, like my wife, who had known me forever, started to kind of see that like something was different, and eventually like started asking me about stuff. I think I evaded. I think one of our kids asked me about like something happening after death, and I said, well, some people believe, and she was like, wait a minute, don't you believe that? Yeah. And so she finally like asked me about it, and I was like, yeah, no, I actually don't believe this anymore, and kind of explained why. And it only took her about 12 hours to come around, believe it or not, because like I said, she had never had that like experiential, I guess, component to her faith. It was just very sort of rote. And so when I kind of explained stuff, I had taken like tons of notes through the process, and I just basically like said, here, read this. And she read it and, was like, yeah, I mean, this totally makes sense to me. Like, I get it. And like, just like that, which is like probably not the way it usually goes down for people, but I was really lucky. Yeah. in that, of course, everybody viewed me as the monster, right? Right. I mean, I was the terrible person that like was dragging my family away from Jesus, but really, like, it was hard for me, and it was a lot easier for them than it was for me. So yeah, then it just became like, all right, well, when is a good time to like tell people? I mean, I still was teaching Sunday school. I was still doing Wednesday night Bible study with youth, and I had to like go do that, and try to find a way to like extricate myself from these things. And we just kind of, I sent a letter. I mean, you can go to my blog and you read all about how that went down. But we ended up inviting over one of the ruling elders to dinner, and gave them a letter to give to the session, and just basically said like, we don't believe anymore. And they, proceeded to put us under church discipline, which for your audience members who don't know, that's something that's practiced in Reformed PCA churches. They consider it like, one of the marks of the church to practice church discipline. So they started the process of like, trying to get us to come back, and then bringing the issue up before the church body, and then giving us a time of like probation, and then cutting us off from the sacraments. And then eventually, like by the end of it all, they just sent us a letter saying like, you're no longer part of the church, which it wasn't as formal as I wanted it to be. I was expecting like, some like, Gothic script, like, writ of excommunication or something across the top. I was kind of bummed. I was looking forward to like framing it, but
welcome to hell.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't even know with mine. I think because we've messaged a little bit, and I've said like, I don't even know if I'm excommunicated or not. Like, I don't know what happened. Like I kind of like wanted to follow up and be like, did you take me off yet? But I just like, whatever, I'm just going to leave it. So. Yeah,
it was a big deal. I mean, we were shielded from a lot of that. Honestly, I mean, I thought we could probably maintain a few friendships with the folks at the church afterwards. I had hoped that we would. I mean, our kids all played together. But I think psychologically, when you do that, you become a betrayer. I don't think people want like to do that. They just sort of naturally do that. And so all of our relationships with these people, they had categorized us as like fellow believer, and then now it was like, nope, not believer anymore. And when you do that, you're no longer like coming into their life from the out group. You're in the in group, and now you've like pulled yourself out. So you're like a traitor. And I don't think they necessarily like think that process through. I just think it's like sort of a natural human thing to do. And it just never, like, I had one of my former pastors came and like talked with us, and he was like, yeah, we can still be friends. And, we'd had some good dialogue, and he wasn't really interested in talking theology with us. He just kind of like wanted to commiserate about some stuff that had gone on in his church. But aside from that, every one of our friends that were part of that church they just wouldn't speak to us anymore. I had one that would occasionally like message me on Facebook and stuff. But he pretty much told me over email, like, I'll message you on Facebook or talk to you on the phone, but until you like repent and come back to Jesus, like don't set foot in my house. So I was like, well, I guess our kids won't be playing together. So it was weird. I mean, there's nothing in that tradition that it's not like Jehovah's Witnesses. Like there's nothing in that tradition that requires them to treat apostates that way.
Right.
I think it just happens naturally. And it was a messy situation. And, if I had to do it all over again, I probably would have just ghosted them.
Yeah. Yeah. My experience wasn't quite as harsh as that, but it was because I still have a Presby buddy to smoke cigars with.
Okay. Well, see, that's nice. I mean, yeah. I would have appreciated that, but I had sort of visions of that, but that didn't happen. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I still have, so it wasn't totally like that, but it was very, it just kind of revealed what I had suspected. I mean, this is kind of like this, I had been in leadership as well, and I had helped lead like community groups, like small groups. And even though I'm generally speaking, I can do well with people and like try to build communities and stuff. But even then I felt like these kind of relationships felt forced in a certain kind of way. And I wanted them to be more personal than they were, but it was still kind of like I would meet with people like for coffee and stuff, but it was still like, even though I didn't want to, I was still viewing them as this kind of means to an end. It's almost impossible not to. And anyway, like I had that kind of my own experience, and that was in the back of my mind when I experienced the way that some of these relationships just totally fell away. It wasn't quite as obviously like, fuck you as yours were. Not, I don't mean to say it like that, but it wasn't as obviously like that as yours. But I don't know. I won't go on a rant. It was just more kind of like relationships that I thought were stronger weren't really that strong.
Yeah, I mean, you find out that the reason why those relationships were there was because of the community and the shared, faith tradition, and that's really what it was based on. I mean, I considered my last pastor to be a friend, but then, after all that went down, I kind of looked back on it and I was like, I don't think in any other context I probably would have been friends with him.
Right.
Just because more of a personality thing, and not because he's a bad guy or whatever. I just don't think we would have gotten along very well and wouldn't have been friends in another context. So that kind of made sense. But I did have people that I thought I would have been friends with in another context, and that was kind of a bummer. Not being able to continue those relationships in the aftermath, especially since, like I said, I'm not really great with the social skills, and so I was left with like no friends. Fortunately, my wife deconverted, so I didn't have to worry about like that, which was like terrifying to me. I probably would have continued to pretend to believe if it meant like that's what I had to do to like stay with her, which kind of makes me wonder how many people do that. But you can't ever get in people's heads to know what they're thinking. But yeah, that was a genuine concern of mine. And then of course, the nice thing about the internet too is that you can find communities, you can find message boards, you can find, subreddits, you can find, places where you can sort of talk to people. It's just, as far as having like physical meeting space with like, in-person live human beings, we visited like a free thought church, and that wasn't going to be for us. And we tried a UU thing for a while, and that was a little too, I guess, crunchy, a nice way of putting it. And so I was like, no, this really isn't our thing either. And, I mean, emotionally it was devastating too, because, I lost my entire social group. I mean, you have a purpose, like you have, I felt like, whether I was teaching Sunday school or leading Bible study or just, volunteering to, set up communion or whatever. I mean, you feel like you're part of something, and you feel like you're contributing to your social group. And that's a very like basic human need, I think, to feel like you're needed in a group of people. And I lost all of that. And I remember shortly after, I had like bouts of anxiety and stuff, not because of like a loss of faith, but because of complete loss of my social group. Mm-hmm. And, I remember like coming home one time, like, just not really begging God, but because I didn't believe God existed, but just wishing to kind of like be, I guess, plugged back into the matrix, but as like maybe like an Episcopalian or something, so that you could have like the best of all of the worlds. You could have the social group, you wouldn't be like a jerk with your theology, and you would have like the acceptance, the broader acceptance socially. Like, are you a Christian? Yeah, I'm a Christian. You could do that. And I felt like, I wish I had been brought up in like, United Methodist tradition or Episcopal tradition or something like that. So that I could, so that I could have all of this and not have, and not have to worry about it. And I don't know if that would have worked or not. But I did kind of feel like one of the characters, Cypher in The Matrix, wanting to be plugged back in.
Yeah.
And I did go through that, and I don't think that way now, but I definitely did at the time. I thought this would have been so much easier if I'd have just been raised in one of these, more progressive Christian faith traditions.
How did your blog help you kind of, did that help you a lot to kind of process like what you were going through to blog it out?
Yeah. I think initially I started the blog because I really expected people to try harder when I left. Yeah. I thought like, okay, I'm going to get this like onslaught of like everybody I've ever known from every church that I've ever been to, and like past friends and stuff are just going to be like constantly contacting me, like trying to talk me back into the faith or witness to me or whatever. And that like never happened. And so my blog, I kind of started that in preparation for that, for something that just never came. And also to kind of like express my thoughts and generally as a catharsis. I look back on some of the stuff that I wrote early on, and it's really snarky. I really kind of like twist the knife on a lot of things that I probably wouldn't do that now. What
are you trying to say? You're trying to say I shouldn't be snarky in my blog?
No. I mean, okay, so like if you're going to go after like conservative evangelicalism, like have at it. Especially now, like especially in this era, I'm just like, you know what, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if you're whatever theological persuasion you are, if you're not a fundamentalist in that theological persuasion, like I'm all for whatever it is you're doing. So yeah, I mean, I say don't pull any punches there, but because we're down the road of just complete and utter silliness now. I mean, evangelicalism now isn't. I don't recognize it anymore, and I don't know if it's because I've been out of it that long and that's the reason why I don't recognize it, or if it really is completely different, or if just this sort of mask fell off. But I look around at evangelicalism now and I think, yeah, it had its problems, but wow, this is ugly. So, yeah, I mean, be as snarky as you want, but I had a tendency to, I think early on, be a little less generous with, and maybe painted with too broad of a brush, because there are a lot of Christians out there that I don't really have much of a problem with. I just, don't believe in God. So,
yeah. So you were saying, just a couple more questions. You had said like, how long did it take for you to start to feel more normal? Because you go through this big social change and like these radical, because it's only been maybe 2 years for me. And so, I still haven't, I guess I don't feel as normal as maybe you would after like 8, because you said it's been kind of close to 8 years for you.
Yeah.
When did it start to feel more normal for you?
A change of geography helped. I mean, I don't know if that's, in the cards for you or not, but we moved, we're still in the same metropolitan area, because I didn't change jobs, but just a change of scenery to a different place helped a lot there. From just a personal well-being standpoint, because once you move into another sphere, like you have to sort of start over, building, some kind of a social group anyway, there, whether neighborhood or, in your kids' like soccer club or whatever. So that helped. Even before that, it was just it just took time. Like I just had to, like my brain had to accept that I was going to be okay, that everything was going to be okay, even apart from my social group. Again, it wasn't, I think a lot of folks might be inclined to think that what I was feeling was a result of like losing God or whatever, but it wasn't that. It was losing my social group that did that. And, once I realized I can make it without these people, I'm going to be okay. There's other areas of society that I can contribute in. There's other things I can do, which is another thing that my blog helped a lot with. Like it made me feel like, whenever somebody would comment or somebody would share it, I would feel like, okay, I do have a place where I can contribute. People would email me or leave comments and say, oh, this really resonated with me. And that gave me the same feeling of belonging, I guess, that I had previously in churches. And so from that perspective, there's the saying that, Christians go to church, but atheists go to the internet. And I think that, that helped a lot there, finding those social networks online, whether it was in, like a private Facebook group or in subreddits or, now on Twitter.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've been going on for a little bit over an hour. I really appreciate you coming on. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was good.
See the mystery man.
Yeah. You got an exclusive there. I've been hiding behind that Julian the Apostate avatar for years now. So yeah, but I still don't use my name. Not because I'm worried of persecution or whatever, but just to kind of protect my anonymity a little bit, because I do for work interact with some folks that might think less of me if they knew that I'm not a Christian and actively sort of blog to undermine it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. All right, well, it was good having you on. Hopefully, maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah,
all right,
appreciate it.
Take care.
All right.